He was a king of England. He ruled millions. And yet, he died alone in the dark, starving. No sword, no executioner, just hunger as a weapon. But how does a crowned king become the most helpless prisoner in the land? It's February 1400. The cold stone walls of Pontefract Castle echo with silence. Inside, on a straw-strewn floor, lies a man who once wore a golden crown. His body is little more than bones draped in pale, lifeless skin. His cheeks have sunk deep, his lips cracked and dry. Every breath rattles like a whisper of defeat. This is Richard II, once an anointed monarch of England, reduced to a shadow of his former self. For months, his captors gave him no blade, no poison, no dramatic execution before cheering crowds. Instead, they chose something far worse: time. They turned his cell into a tomb and his hunger into a weapon. Slowly, methodically, they starved a king to death. Why? Why not a swift death on the scaffold? Why make him endure this agony in the dark? Who were the hands that signed his fate, and why did they do it this way? Because this wasn't just murder. This was a message. A warning carved not in stone, but in the suffering of a man who once believed he ruled by divine right. But Richard's story didn't begin in chains. It began in silk, in crowns and cheers. And to understand why England's most powerful man ended as its weakest prisoner, we have to go back to the day a 10-year-old boy was given a throne he was never ready to hold. And that single moment set in motion the betrayal that would kill him. He never wanted the crown, but fate had other plans. Richard of Bordeaux was never supposed to rule England. He was the second son, the spare, not the heir. His older brother, Edward of Angoulême, was destined for the throne. Richard? He was meant to live quietly in the shadow of giants. His father, Edward the Black Prince, a war hero whose name terrified the French, and his grandfather, Edward III, one of the most celebrated kings in English history. But destiny has a cruel sense of humor. First, his brother dies suddenly. Then, his father, the legendary Black Prince, succumbs to a wasting illness. By 1377, Edward III, England's rock for half a century, draws his last breath. And so, a boy of just 10 years old is crowned King of England. 10 years old. A child who barely knew his Latin lessons, now expected to command armies, balance kingdoms, and stare down scheming lords twice his age. Picture that coronation at Westminster Abbey. The golden crown resting on hair still soft from childhood. The roar of the crowds. The blinding splendor of pageantry. But behind the silk and ceremony lurked vultures in velvet robes, ambitious nobles circling the throne, waiting to carve out their share of power. And at the center of this political storm, John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle. A man as rich as kings, as cunning as foxes. He and the Regency Council would govern in Richard's name, but never forget whose interests they truly served. The boy king smiled for the crowds that day, but inside, he was already learning his first bitter truth. In England, loyalty was for sale, and the price was never cheap. But the real storm wouldn't come from the palace. It would come from the streets. Imagine being 14 years old and facing an army of thousands at your gates. It's 1381. England is boiling with anger. Decades of war have drained the treasury. Taxes rise higher and higher. And then comes the breaking point, a poll tax that crushes the poor. The countryside erupts in flames. Men with pitchforks and axes march toward London. Their leader? A fiery commoner named Wat Tyler. Their demand? Justice or blood. They storm the capital. Royal officials are slaughtered. Noble houses burn. They even breach the Tower of London, a humiliation no king could forget. And where is Richard in all this? Hiding, watching his kingdom slip from his fingers. But then, something extraordinary happens. The boy king rides out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, face to face. 14 years old, surrounded by men who could tear him apart. Richard speaks calmly, promises them freedom, the end of serfdom, justice, for all. The mob cheers. For a moment, it looks like the king has saved his crown, but it's a lie. As soon as their leader, Wat Tyler, falls in a scuffle with the mayor, Richard moves fast. He rallies his nobles. The rebels, leaderless and confused, scatter. And then, the real horror begins. Mass executions, heads on spikes, bodies swinging from gallows. The promises Richard made vanish like smoke. His mercy was a mask. His vengeance, swift and merciless. And in that moment, the boy who once seemed gentle and bookish learns the lesson that will define the rest of his life. Mercy is weakness. Power is survival. But that lesson will destroy him. And then, love walked into his life and for a moment saved him. Her name was Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. She wasn't a trophy bride chosen for power. She became something far rarer in royal history. Richard's true love. When they married in 1382, people whispered that it was just politics, but they were wrong. Against all odds, this political union blossomed into one of the most genuine love stories of the medieval age. Anne was gentle, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. She had no taste for bloodshed, and somehow, she softened him. The harsh edges Richard had shown during the Peasants' Revolt began to fade. For a time, the boy king who was growing into a hard man found a reason to trust again. Under Anne's influence, England glimpsed a golden age. The court filled with poets and scholars. Geoffrey Chaucer himself wrote under Richard's patronage. Music and art replaced whispers of rebellion. Diplomacy began to take the place of war. For a brief moment, Richard's reign felt like what it was always meant to be, a time of peace and progress. Historians call these years the calm before the storm, because that peace rested on one thing, not policy, not power, not fear. It rested on her. But what happens when the only light in your life goes out? Anne's death didn't just break his heart, it broke his mind. The plague returns to England like a phantom in the night. Anne falls sick. Within days, she's gone. Richard's grief is so violent, he orders the palace where she died destroyed, as if erasing the walls could erase his pain. But nothing can erase it. Not prayers, not power. And so grief curdles into something darker. Rage, paranoia, revenge. The man who once loved art and beauty becomes obsessed with absolute control. He begins to see enemies everywhere. He demands obedience like a god, claiming kingship is divine right, and any opposition is blasphemy. The crown that once seemed too heavy for a boy now feels like armor and a weapon. Richard surrounds himself with flatterers who praise him as a second Christ, while those who dare to question him, stripped of lands, exiled, or worse, quietly erased. Nobles whisper behind closed doors, "Our king is losing his mind." And for the first time, those whispers begin to sound like a plan. And into this chaos stepped the one man Richard should never have betrayed. He was family, blood. But in Richard's world, blood didn't mean loyalty, it meant war. His name was Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's first cousin. A warrior, a politician, a man who understood power in ways Richard never could. For years, Henry had been loyal or at least careful. He fought in wars, served the crown, and kept his ambitions quiet. But then came 1399. Henry's father, John of Gaunt, dies. By law, Henry should inherit the vast Duchy of Lancaster, one of the greatest estates in Europe. Lands, castles, wealth beyond imagining. Instead, Richard makes a move that shocks the kingdom. He seizes it all. The reason? Paranoia. Richard fears Henry's influence, fears his popularity, fears his military skill. So he tears up centuries of law and takes everything for himself. In that moment, Richard doesn't just rob a man of his birthright, he robs England of its trust in the crown. And here's the twist. This isn't about property anymore. Every noble in England sees the message. If Richard can strip Henry of his inheritance, none of us are safe. Suddenly, what was one man's grievance becomes a national crisis. Henry is exiled, humiliated, and broken, or so Richard thinks. But in exile, Henry plots, patiently, quietly, waiting for the moment to strike, and when Richard left England for Ireland, the trap snapped shut. No battles, no bloodshed, just betrayal moving like a shadow across England. Summer, 1399. Richard sails to Ireland to crush a rebellion. He takes his loyal men with him, leaving England vulnerable. To him, it seems like a show of strength. In reality, it's the biggest mistake of his life, because while Richard is gone, Henry Bolingbroke returns. At first, his claim sounds harmless. I only want what's mine, my father's lands. But everyone knows that's a lie. Henry lands in Yorkshire with a small force, and within days, the nobility rallies to his side. Lords who once bowed to Richard now switch allegiance without hesitation. Why? Because Richard has alienated them all. Years of arrogance, greed, and tyranny have rotted the foundation of his power. The man who called himself God's anointed now finds himself abandoned by everyone who mattered. Richard hurries back from Ireland, desperate to reclaim his throne. But it's too late. By the time he sets foot on English soil, Henry is not just claiming his inheritance, he's claiming the crown. And the most shocking part? Not a single sword needs to be raised. Richard's throne collapses without a war, without a battle, without a drop of noble blood spilled. His kingdom is stolen in silence. When Richard came back, England wasn't his anymore. The king who believed he ruled by divine right now knelt like a broken man. It happens at Flint Castle, the great hall, silent but heavy with humiliation. Richard, once the anointed monarch, stands before his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. Only weeks ago, Richard commanded armies. Today, he commands nothing. His nobles are gone. His friends are dead or in hiding. His throne? Already claimed. Henry doesn't draw a sword. He doesn't need to. He offers terms instead. Step down and you will live. Resist and you will die. Richard hesitates. For all his arrogance, for all his belief in divine right, the will to fight is gone. He wants to live, even if it means surrendering everything. So, in a ceremony designed to break him completely, Richard removes the crown. He hands over the scepter. He even speaks the words himself. I resign the throne to you, my cousin. In that moment, England witnesses something it has never seen before. A king willingly, though not freely, giving up the crown. He believes Henry's promise. He believes his life is safe. He even dares to hope for quiet exile. But mercy in medieval England was never mercy, it was a lie. Because mercy was just another word for delay. No blade touched him. No rope hung him. His killers chose something worse time. Richard is sent north to Pontefract Castle, a cold, stone fortress that feels more like a tomb than a prison. At first, the treatment seems decent. A bed, meals, a small household. He thinks, maybe I'll live after all. But then, the walls start closing in. His servants disappear. His letters are intercepted. And then comes the most silent weapon of all, hunger. Not outright starvation, not yet. The food becomes less and less, bread without meat, water without wine. Then even that begins to vanish. Slowly, deliberately. They don't want him dead in a day. They want him broken in mind and body before the end. Weeks turn into months. Richard, once proud and vain, becomes a hollow skeleton. His cheeks sink, his clothes hang loose. Hunger gnaws not just at his stomach, but at his soul. He understands now. Henry never intended for him to live. Historians believe he lasted 3 months this way, 3 months of unimaginable agony. Alone, betrayed, forgotten. Until one February night in 1400, the last breath rattles from his lips, and Richard II, King of England, is dead. Not on a battlefield, not at an executioner's block, but on a filthy floor, starved like a common criminal. But even in death, Richard had one last role to play. They didn't hide his corpse, they paraded it. When Richard's body finally leaves Pontefract, it isn't buried in secret. It's displayed. In London. For everyone to see. A skeletal frame, cheeks hollow, hands stiff in death. The message is clear. The king is dead. Henry rules now. Henry's men spread their story. Richard died of grief. Convenient, isn't it? But the whispers tell a different truth. He was murdered, starved by order of the new king. The crowds file past, staring at the broken shell of a man who once wore a crown of gold. Some weep, others cheer. But all understand the message. In England, the price of failure isn't exile. Its death. And so ends the life of Richard II, the king who ruled like a god and died like a beggar. His story is a warning carved in history. Power doesn't just corrupt, it kills. And in Richard's England, it killed with an empty plate.